I have another one of these videos where I talk about historical fiction to read if you are new and want to try it from various different genres, which I will leave in the cards above. Today we're going to talk about if you are new to literary fiction and want to dip your toes in, what you should read based on the genres you already know and love. First one is fairly obvious, and that is if you are already a romance reader, I would recommend you read Normal People by Sally Rooney. A lot of people list this as romance and talk about it as a romance, but considering romance requires a happily ever after, I'm not spoiling the ending for you, but I would definitely say it is a little more complicated than your straightforward romance novel. Normal People tells the story of Connell and Marianne, two young people growing up in Ireland in the 2010s in the wake of the crash of the Celtic Tiger. And we have Marianne, who is from a very middle class, wealthy but distanced family, and Connell is the working class child of a single mother, which is a big deal, particularly in Ireland at the time. And they end up dating whilst in secondary school, but they keep it secret from everyone. Marianne is kind of a weirdo and an outcast at school, and Connell is very popular. Then they both go off to Trinity, which is a university in Dublin. Their circumstances change because they've gone from this small town in kind of rural Ireland to the big city, to a place where there are a lot of people who are very, very posh. The central part of it is this relationship between Connell and Marianne, the push and pull they have with one another, the ways that their circumstances in life alter the way that they see one another, their mental health and the ways they take it out on themselves and each other. And it has that relationship and those beautiful lines. I think the one that's all over Instagram is, "I'm not a religious person, but I believe God made you for me," something like that. And so it definitely has the swoony moments, but it's definitely not a swoony book in general. There's a lot more to it in terms of looking at ideas of class and mental health, kind of sex and violence and gender and the relationship between those three things. It is also written in a more like literary style, a lack of quotation marks, which I know a lot of people don't enjoy, but also this sort of perspective shifting where it moves from Connell to Marianne's perspective and back again over the course of a paragraph, but it still has very much character focused and relationship focused. So I think if you're a romance reader, you will enjoy it. So, next, if you like to read family sagas, and for this I would recommend White Teeth by Zadie Smith. This is set in London in the 1970s up through to modern day. Well, there's a bit of Second World War in there as well. So there's various different generations explored in two families. So we have two men who during the war were together in a tank. And one of them is Pakistani Muslim and the other is a white British man. And then they return to England. And the Pakistani Muslim has an arranged marriage, and the white Englishman marries a much younger Jamaican woman who had been a Jehovah's Witness, and then they have children. And their children go to a comprehensive school around the corner. There are two twin boys, one of whom gets more into Islam and one of whom gets kind of obsessed with a middle-class English family. Ideas of gender, race and class, which is what Zadie Smith always writes about pretty much. Those things come up a lot, but also in this there is sort of genetic predisposition, nature versus nurture, and what it means to be born from something, the importance of heritage and bloodline, and whether those things are truly important, and also the way that in which we are raised, the culture in which we are raised, and if those things are incompatible. And I also really love Zadie Smith's dialogue. I think she's great at writing dialogue that is witty and funny, characters that are very flawed but very human. They feel very real. She has such a strong sense of London. Lots of her books are set in northwest London, and this is no exception to that. And I think that the voice of the place in which she is set is very alive and very humming. I think it has all of the things you want from family saga. There are secrets that are uncovered, there are twists and turns, there are complicated interpersonal relationships, there are mirrors and resonances and echoes that come throughout the book, and it is again a very character focused book, which I think is a lot of the thing about why people enjoy family saga. And I think Zadie Smith is a great one because she is so funny, so easy to read, so immediately engaging, but also just a stellar writer really on a sentence to sentence level. If you're someone who likes to read a funny book, Zadie Smith is great, but another one that I would recommend is Lost on Me by Veronica Raimo. This one is also kind of a family comedy situation. I don't really read a lot of non-literary comedy, so I'm not like very aware of that genre, but this book was one of the funniest books that I've read in a while. It is a short little novel translated from Italian about a girl called Veronica growing up with her family in Rome, and it is very kind of strange and surreal. And she tells the story of her being a child and a teenager, wanting to be a pop star, mother who is obsessed with the fact that her older brother might die, and she feels kind of alienated by this, and then her father who is constantly putting up literal walls in their apartment, making things smaller and smaller, cutting things in half like windows. And it is just a really silly, surreal, out there book, but also one that deals with family and loss, and there is like a sad tone of mourning that also comes through the novel, a lot about death, a very Catholic way of looking at death, I think. If you want to get into like the more non-linear, the more like slice of life, absolutely things happen and there are definitely events, but the fact that things happen isn't the important part of the book. These are really witty, wonderfully funny, really engaging characters, and which makes it super easy. So I think if you read a lot of humour, you would really enjoy it, but it is also an interesting meditation on writing and what it means to become a writer, and the ways that we tell stories, and unreliable narrators, or even the unreliability of our own memories, and the ways that our own perspective on events shapes our vision of the world. It is a funny novel with a lot going on underneath it, which I think definitely puts it on the more literary end of things. Another one that seems simplistic but has a lot going on underneath, and for if you are a fan of cozy books, cozy mystery, cozy fantasy, cozy anything, this would be cozy literary, is My Name is Lucy Barton by Elizabeth Strout. This one is about a woman who is a writer, and she is telling a story about the time she was in hospital after an illness, and her mother came to visit her in New York. And it was the first time her mother came to visit her because they were semi-estranged after her traumatic childhood, where she grew up in poverty and with a lot of dark things happening within her family. And so it is someone telling a story about someone telling a story. There's a lot of layers of memory within it. There is something very wholesome about the writing, something very sweet about the character. She feels like such a nice person. There's so much like loveliness to the way the book is written, and to the character, and the way that she thinks about the world and talks about her world. But at the same time, there is these things that are happening in the past that slowly their layers get uncovered for us, and there is complex layered relationships for which you don't ever get told anything directly. It is a very indirect way of reading, which I think is why I would class it as literary. The feeling of what is happening comes to you without being directly told anything, really. We understand our characters through their presence and almost through osmosis. It is more like getting to know real people than it is being told about real people, and so I think that makes it such an interesting way of exploring these characters, because it is a story about impressions. The fact that we only understand the plot and the characters through impressions, it feels like a wholesome read despite the darkness that is going on underneath it. So that's why I'd classify it as cozy, and also I think one of the skills of the novel, it feels very simple, and it feels very straightforward, but there is more to it than necessarily meets the eye at first. If you enjoy dystopian fiction, if you enjoy speculative, strange futures, then one I would recommend is Pink Slime by Fernanda Trias. This is a Uruguayan book in translation, and it is about it's about a town in Uruguay where there has been kind of almost a biblical plague. The river turns red, and then all these dead fish wash up, and then all the birds die, and so people have moved further into the interior because a plague has come as well. Our main character is a woman whose ex-husband is in the hospital because he has caught this plague, and he is one of the few people who has not died of it. Her mother has moved into one of the big houses that was abandoned by the rich people, and she is looking after the son of a wealthy family who just keeps eating everything, and by everything I mean non-food items, and going as far as like eating on his own fingers. And so it has that end of days quality that people like from dystopia. Individual moving through a world where the things that cause a civilization to function are no longer functioning, and we see the effects that this has on people. But the way that it is different from dystopia is that it is much more slow and much more still. Our main character seems very apathetic and very reluctant to change because of this world. There isn't a sense of impending doom or terror, just a slow crumbling. It was written during COVID. It does have a feeling of lockdown with a more extreme world outside, but it feels much more insular and much more trapped feeling than a lot of the dystopian fiction where there is more plot and we see a bigger part part of the world. This is very much restricted. It is also really beautiful, the descriptions of what has happened and the descriptions of her walking past a city that she used to know. The ways that these relationships are still difficult are not repaired by the ending of the world. And I think it is one that really struck me because I tend to dislike dystopian fiction because I feel like it always tells the same story, it hits the same beats over and over. This one felt like it definitely didn't do that. It's much more atmospheric than I think a lot of dystopia tends to be. Now this one's quite obvious, but if you're a fan of the classics, then I would recommend you read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And Demon Copperhead is a retelling of David Copperfield that does have a feel of the Victorian novel, but in a much more up-to-date way. It tells the story of Demon, who is a young boy in Appalachia in the 90s and early 2000s, and it explores much the same beats as David Copperfield, the idea of child poverty, of corruption and abuse that traps people in cycles of poverty and cycles of abuse, this time more focused on the opioid crisis in the United States. It also talks about like the abuse of the foster care system, and also the view that Americans have of Appalachia. It is one of the voiciest books I've ever read. The character of Demon narrates his own story to you, as David Copperfield does, and his voice was so thoroughly realised. It was so wonderful. It is written a lot in in a slightly more Appalachian style dialect, although not in a way that is incomprehensible for non-Americans. And I really think that lent a lot to the book, giving it such a strong sense of place and of time and of person. It is a tragic, dark book, but there are moments of hope and beauty and light and wonderful relationships. It has humour, which is something that Charles Dickens attempts to use as well, but I found it more engaging in Barbara Kingsolver's writing. Just found it so incredibly compelling a read. So if you have read David Copperfield, it's interesting to read to compare the two, but even if you haven't, it has that kind of big cast of characters that change over the course of the novel, that you are maybe used to from reading classics. It has the density of language and real poetry in the way that it is written as well, which is something you may be a fan of from the classics. And I think that focus on place and this idea almost directly addressing you about the ails of society that it is looking at, that comes from a classic novel, particularly a Victorian novel. I think if you are an enjoyer of classics for any of those reasons, I think this one would work for you. If you normally read YA and you are looking to get into adult literary fiction, then I would recommend The Seas by Samantha Hunt. This is another coming of age story about a teenage girl in coastal US town in the 90s, I believe, and she is got this kind of obsession with this idea that she might be a mermaid because her father told her he was a mermaid before he walked into the sea and was never seen again. She lives with her grandfather and her mother in this kind of strange ramshackle house, where her grandfather is creating a dictionary and is constantly like setting type, and she also gets into a relationship with a man who has post-traumatic stress disorder from the first Gulf War, and he is in his 30s and she is 19. Father issues, her own mental health issues, all of those things come to the fore. And so because it is based on a character who is 19, because it has a lot of the kind of melodrama and melancholy that come from YA, there is a lot of pining and bad decisions that I think people enjoy in contemporary YA plots, particularly because of our characters' loose grip on reality, but it is much more poetically written, much more slow moving, not super plotty. So whilst there are events that happen in the novel, it is again one where the plot is not the main focus. The main focus is the internal turmoil of this girl, and I think it is so moving and beautifully written if you have ever been a teenage girl, and I really enjoy the way that it plays with the metaphors of the sea and the way that it plays with the idea of what is of reality and of what is poetry and what is beyond that, to be our main character perhaps slipping from her grasp on reality. I found it incredibly engaging and one that I was kind of obsessed with in the way that I think YA reads can be so propulsive and obsessive, and so I think if you are used to reading something that really grips you like that, despite the fact that this doesn't necessarily have the same grip from a plot perspective, I think it could take you with it. Another one with a very watery aspect, if you are normally a horror reader, then I would recommend Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. I think if you are a horror reader who likes like slashers, this one might not be for you, but if you like unnerving, unsettling things, then I definitely think Our Wives Under the Sea is a great step in the literary horror direction. This is about a woman whose wife has gone on a submarine excursion and she comes back changed. There is something not right about her anymore. She wants to sit in the bath all day and drink salt water. Whilst we do get glimpses of what happened in the submarine mission, it is much more about the relationship between these two women, a meditation on grief and loss and the repetitive nature of that, with a very sort of rhythmical water, ocean wave kind of feeling to the repetitiveness of what happens during a breakdown like that. There are also moments of really like intense body things in this, kind of gross body elements that I think lean more towards the horror, as well as the moments that happen under the sea that have the tension and the darkness and the lack of like what is going on between these characters. How did this actually happen? Is there a big conspiracy afoot? But it is not a book where that plot is central to it. It is just moments of that feeling of tension and that feeling of uncertainty and being unsettled. I found it to be incredibly moving and just so beautifully written and so captivating. The way that it deals with the themes of love and loss and grief, I think it's just so subtle and lovely. For most genre fiction, plot is really important and really central, and for a lot of the literary books, plot is secondary or even tertiary. Like what is the actual events of a novel are far less important than the ideas of the novel, and I think that that is definitely true for Our Wives Under the Sea, but I personally found it very captivating and just so beautiful. And the final genre that I want to talk about is historical fiction, and literary historical fiction is my like main comfort zone read, so I obviously could go on about this for a very long time. If you want a full list of literary historical fiction, I can. I do have 2 videos where I recommend 10 historical fiction books in each, and both of them are probably mostly literary historical fiction, so if you're looking for that you can go and watch those videos linked in the cards above. But the one I'm going to talk about now is North Woods by Daniel Mason, and the reason I think this is such a good bridge or step from historical fiction into literary historical fiction is because it covers such a breadth, and because it has such like variation in style. So if you are someone who loves early modern historical fiction, if you're into like Tudors, Puritan times, then it has elements of that. If you love a Victorian historical fiction, we have moments of that. If you're more into like mid 20th century historical fiction, it covers all of it, because it is the story of a dwelling, the story of a house in New England over the course of the centuries, from when it was built as just a little shack where 2 people live as they flee the Puritan town where they lived because they are having an affair, over the course of the next 300-400 years. A pair of rather strange sisters who run an orchard, zany Victorian sex comedy involving a medium and ghosts, and a 1960s psychiatrist and man with suspected schizophrenia. Really a romp through the ages. It travelled so fast. Oh, there's gay Victorians as well in it. What Daniel Mason is really good at is writing in each of those different styles in a way that feels really authentic and that blends really nicely from one into the other. The focus is on this house, on this dwelling, and particularly it's sort of a covering of the myth of America, the idea of what it is to be American and how America was formed and grew, with the ghosts of America's past continuing to haunt it through across the time period. And so whilst these characters seem to be disparate, they're not all related, they're not all connected in any clear way. The fact, apart from the idea of this house, but the way that the past exists throughout is very, very resonant and very relevant. And so I think it's a really fun book to read. There are moments that I cried and there are moments that made me laugh out loud. So it definitely has a great like emotional arc, a great taster for some literary historical fiction. Let me know in the comments down below any genres I missed that you would like a literary fiction recommendation for. I will try and think of some for you, and if there are enough requests, I maybe will make a part 2 to this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you are new here, my name is Roisin. I put out new videos twice a week, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.